Good morning, and once again, I'd like to welcome you to the Greenbrier Church Online. Today, we make it to the 10th commandment, or the 10th rule for the relationship God has invited us to be a part of. My hope, as we've worked through this study, was to try to remind you that God has invited us to take part in His story. It's a story that's honest and raw, and at times uncomfortable. Back in Genesis 1, the story begins when God speaks the world and everything we know into creation. God puts man in the garden, gives him a paradise. Adam has every need met. He has purpose, shelter, food, and most importantly, he has a real community through his relationship with God. You would think Adam had everything: an amazing place to live, a job, his uninterrupted community with the Creator, and yet Adam still craves for more. So God causes Adam to fall asleep, and from his rib, God creates Eve. As Genesis 2 ends, Adam and Eve are living in paradise, in perfect community with God. They walk together, they spend time together, and I need you to notice that God doesn't just spend time with Adam or just spends time with Eve. God doesn't pick sides. God never has favorites. God designed this community so that everyone could spend time together. When we get to chapter 3, we see that Adam and Eve are faced with the decision: do I want a relationship with God, or do I want something else? They had everything that they could imagine, but it wasn't enough. They imagined they wanted more. It's a story that we read time and time again in the pages of Scripture, and one that we see in our everyday lives. God offers himself to his creation, and the creation wants God and something else. We were created to live in community with God, a community he established. But our story is filled with moves and counter moves. Genesis 2, God creates community. Genesis 3, Satan counter moves and destroys that community. In Genesis 6, God moves through Noah and reestablishes community. In Genesis 9, Satan counter moves through Ham and destroys the community. Genesis 12, God calls Abraham out of Ur to establish community. Genesis 12, Satan counter moves, and through fear, Abraham lies. Once again, we see this cycle continues all throughout the Bible, and every day the cycle continues, even up to this morning. God invites us to be in a community with him, and we long for something more. And in that search for something more, we find ourselves in a place where we need to be rescued. So once again, God comes in and reestablishes community. As God closes out the rules of his relationship, he puts community at the forefront of the discussion. He uses the word neighbor 3 times in the 10th commandment. There are no loners in the family of God. We're all connected to one another, regardless of the color of our skin, the neighborhood we live in, the language that we speak, our gender, our level of education. None of that matters because we are connected to the Creator. And so the last of the commandments is, in many ways, as comprehensive as the first. The 10th commandment is solely focused on the interior of the human heart. It's not concerned so much with what we do, but more of how we think. It's less about our action and more about our attitude. Where the 8th commandment forbids stealing, the 10th commandment says, don't even think about it. The 7th command condemns adultery. The 10th command warns, don't think about it. That doesn't mean that the 10th commandment's not interested in our behavior. God knows that our actions begin as thoughts, and the heart of the 10th commandment is exactly what James says in James chapter 1. Temptation comes from our own desires, which entice us and drag us away. These desires give birth to sinful actions. Before a thief ever steals, he first coveted his neighbor's possessions. Before a man or a woman ever give in to adultery, they first coveted someone else's spouse. Before the first word of slander is ever spoken, the gossip coveted someone else's reputation. Now, the word covet simply means desire, and desire is neutral. In 1 Corinthians 12:31, Paul says, but eagerly desire the greater gifts. Paul actually uses the word that means covet. He's referring to the gift of love, and he says that it's right to covet the gift of loving others. There's nothing wrong with desires or goals or dreams. In fact, our ability to imagine and to fashion a better world than the one that we are given is one of our greatest attributes. But when we begin to covet the lesser gifts, then our desires take us away from God and from his community. The last commandment's pretty clear. It doesn't just say, you shall not covet. It's pretty specific. You shall not covet your neighbor's house, or your neighbor's wife, or his servants, or his ox, or donkey, or anything that belongs to your neighbor. You see, the focus isn't on stuff, it's on community. Even the language emphasizes relationship, neighbor, neighbor, his, neighbor. God makes a reference to your neighbor 7 times in one verse. When we covet our neighbor's possessions, whether they're the things that they own or the relationships that they cherish, some sinister things begin to happen in our hearts. You see, we were created to value people more than things. We were created to value community more than possessions. We were created to find fulfillment in our relationships with one another, other people created in the image of God. Yet oftentimes we get short-sighted. We look at the creation and what it has to offer, and we forget about why we were created in the first place. And if that story sounds familiar, it should. It's a story that's been told 1,000,000 times since Genesis 3. Now, I know you could stay and listen to me preach all day, but let me just share one story with you this morning. It's found in Luke chapter 12, starting in verse 13. Then someone called from the crowd, "Teacher, please tell my brother to divide the father's estate with me." Jesus replied, "Friend, who made me a judge over you to decide such things as that?" Then he said, "Beware, guard against every kind of greed. Life is not measured by how much you own." Then he told a parable. A rich man had a fertile farm that produced fine crops, and he said to himself, "What should I do? I don't have any more room for all my crops." Then he said, "I know, I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. Then I'll have enough room to store all of my wheat and all of my other goods. And I can sit back and say to myself, 'My friend, you have enough stored away for years to come. Take it easy, eat, drink, and be merry.' But God said to him, 'You fool, you will die this very night. Then who will get everything you worked for?' Yes, a person is a fool to store up earthly wealth, but not have a rich relationship with God." Picture the scene in your mind. Jesus is teaching and suddenly someone interrupts him, and Jesus correctly diagnoses the man's problem as covetousness. Actually, he calls it greed. Then Jesus diagnoses the fact that the sickness of the heart always produces 2 problems. First, it destroys our relationship with one another. Did you notice that Jesus says, "Who made me a judge or an arbitrator over you?" Jesus knew that something had already come between this man and his brother. This man had chosen stuff over family, things over community. The truth about human nature is that when we get focused on things, we lose the ability to see anyone else. Think about it this way. What's the difference between a mirror and a piece of glass? The mirror is just glass with silver on the back of it. And while you can see through glass, the silver on the mirror only allows you to see yourself. The same is true in our lives. When we get focused on the silver, on the stuff, we lose the ability to see other people. When we covet what someone else has, we lose the ability to see that person. All we can see is their possessions. They're no longer our siblings or our friends or folks created in the image of God that we are called to love. They become our rivals. We see them as competitors to be beaten, not friendships to be nurtured. They're no longer beings made in the image of God, but the possessors of the things that we want. The things that they have become more important than the people they are. Which leads us to the second issue. We begin to measure our success not by the depth of our character or the abundance of our relationships, but by our piles of stuff. Our struggle with success is that it often leads us to define our lives by how high a pile of things rather than how deep a soul we have. That was the fatal flaw the rich fool made. To him and all of us that are guilty with covetousness, success has less to do with who we are and more to do with how much we own. One of the problems of that definition of success is that we never really get there. Someone else always has a bigger pile. There's always an upgraded gadget, a bigger house, a newer style. A young couple may set their hearts on being the first in their circle of friends to get out of an apartment and into a house. And they may succeed. But then someone else will build a bigger house or furnish it more elaborately or locate it in a more affluent area or park a nicer car in the larger garage. Suddenly, being the first to own a house, it's just not enough. It has to be a bigger house with nicer furnishings in a better neighborhood. The rich man in Jesus' story had to have a bigger barn to store all of his stuff, all of his things. And if Jesus hadn't ended the story, you know what would have happened next. The bigger barns would have made his pile of stuff look smaller. So he would have said to himself, I've got nice big barns and there's not enough stuff to fill them. So now I got to go buy more fields, raise more crops to fill my bigger barns. Then I'll eat, drink, and be merry. But then his barns would have been too small for this new pile of stuff, so we would have had to tear those barns down and build even bigger barns, then more fields, then bigger barns, and the cycle just continues to go round and round and round. When we define our success by the size of our pile, we get sucked into a cyclone of dissatisfaction. We spin around, unable to stop, unable to rest, unable to find peace. And this desire to have more and more clashes with our ability to find contentment in the community that God offers us. The result is havoc in our lives, havoc in our souls, and we end up cherishing things more than people. We live with a distorted definition of success, and we become desynthesized to sin. Satan might be evil, but he's not an idiot. The Bible shows tremendous respect for this sly creativity, his ability to slowly seduce us. Satan's not always a roaring lion. Sometimes he's sly as a fox or as sneaky as a serpent. Do you remember the story of Joseph and Potiphar's wife in Genesis 39? One day, Joseph diligently managing Potiphar's house when Mrs. Potiphar comes and entices him, saying, "Sleep with me." There's no time to think, so Joseph reacted. He left his coat in her hand and ran away from the house. Now, Joseph has never even entertained the idea of committing adultery with Potiphar's wife, because when he's first approached with this idea, his reply is, "My master doesn't give a second thought to anything that goes on here. He's put me in charge of everything he owns. He treats me as his equal. The only thing he hasn't turned over to me is you. You're his wife, after all. How could I violate his trust and sin against God?" Joseph's greatest desire was his community with God. But what if? What if Joseph had coveted his master's wife? What if he had developed a resentful heart because of everything that had happened to him in the past couple months? He's now working as a slave in a rich Egyptian's house because his own brothers despised him. They threw him in a pit, and they only pulled him out of the pit so that they could sell him into slavery. Now he's a servant, when just a few days ago he was being served. This is not how he had envisioned his life. This was not what was supposed to happen. And now look at all this man has. So what if, in the privacy of his own heart, Joseph indulged the thought of sleeping, having sex with his master's wife? Then what would have happened when Miss Potiphar made the offer for Joseph to sleep with her? Covetousness slowly reduces our sensitivity to sin. It allows us to justify our desires. In a backhanded kind of way, that's what Satan does to us. He tries to get us to imagine a time or a place where all of our desires can be met, but not one where we're faithful or honest. He wants us to move in this opposite direction. So he doesn't try to get us to steal. He just wants us to think about how good it would be to have the nice things that our neighbor has. He doesn't send us a prince who is as emotionally sensitive as he is handsome to sweep us off our feet. There's no Scarlett Johansson look-alike who knows how to make us feel like a real man. He sends a mental suggestion, a simple what if, a subtle I wonder what it would be like a sinister why not. That's why when Jesus deepens our call to community in the Sermon on the Mount, he says, "He who looks on a woman to lust after her has already committed adultery with her in his heart." We haven't actually committed the sin, but we've taken a giant step towards it because we are no longer shocked by the thought or the idea of it. After all, if you can entertain the thought, you can commit the sin. That's why the 10th commandment is so powerful. It attacks sin at the root. It seeks to purify the soil of the heart before sin becomes a weed in our lives. It shows us the true value of community. And that's why we gather at the tables. You see, God has created and called us into real community, but far too often we have settled for all of the counterfeit things the world offers. True community with God consists of loving Him with all of our heart, mind, soul, body, and strength. The second rule of community is just like the first: love the people God loves. So as we gather at the tables this morning, we need to have an honest conversation about how we value people and how we value things. While God never calls us to a life of simplicity, He does call us to use what we have been blessed with to bless others. That's why we gather at the table. We take the bread, we take the cup, we spend a moment to think about what do our hearts truly desire most in this world. Our questions for the table this morning is first, what do you want most in life? And take the time to be honest. God knows your heart. You're not going to surprise Him by your answer, but you might surprise yourself. So don't give a church-approved answer. Be honest. Where do you spend your money, your time, and your talent? What are you really trying to achieve? And then the second question, what are you doing to get what you want? Those questions will help us begin the journey to once again find the real, true community that God not only designed us for, but through the cross, God supplies. I hope you have a wonderful day this morning. I hope you enjoy your time communing with God and with one another around the table. And as always, please know that you are loved. We look forward to seeing you very soon. Go in peace.